To Friday's Escape to the Forest by the Ohio Woodland Stewards Program. My name is Kathy Smith. I'm our Extension Program Director in Forestry. With us today as my co-host is Marnie Tichenell. Marnie is our Wildlife Program Specialist. And today we're going to talk pawpaws. First up though, there are credits for both ISA and SAF. At the end of the session, I will post a link in the chat box. Click that link, fill in your information, and we'll get your credits to the proper institution. This is part of our Friday Escape to the Forest that we started, back in April, I guess. And so when we don't have webinars, we tend to post some other information for folks, and you can find that information on our Woodland Stewards website under resources. There are some side tabs that try to sort it out for you if it's an invasive topic or woodland or wildlife. You can catch that stuff there. We're not doing it every Friday like we initially started. We've kind of backed off on that a little bit, and we're doing a little more focus on the webinars, so stay tuned. Next month is From Tree to Table, talking about Ohio maple syrup, and it'll be hopefully, if Mother Nature cooperates, kind of in the middle of the season or at the very beginning of the season, we'll see. For today, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will work on those questions with our speaker after the presentation, so put them in there. If you put them in the chat box, we don't monitor that quite as closely, so put them in the Q&A, and then we'll work our way through them for the time we have left of the session this morning. So again, this will be recorded and posted on our Woodland Stewards website. So with that, I threw a ringer photo in here, Matt, not the typical fruit photo, because a lot of folks I know never see the pawpaw bloom. But today's talk, picking pawpaw patches, managing woodlands for pawpaw production. It's a prime question as a field forester I would get. What are these things in my woods? What do I do with them? You know, who eats all that fruit? Because it's never there forever. So we have Matt Davies with us today, who is one of our professors in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. And with that, Matt, I'm gonna let you share your screen, and Marnie and I will zone out for the talk.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction there, Kathy, and for inviting me along to give this talk today. Really pleased to be here and be sharing some of our research on pawpaws with you. You're not the only person who's had that, like, what are these things in my woods and what do I do with it kind of question, because as most people have probably immediately realized, I'm not from North America. And I arrived in Ohio at OSU about 6 years or so ago, and an undergraduate student came and approached me who wanted to study honeysuckle invasion in woodlands, which is a subject I was interested in. I'm a restoration ecologist by background and do work on kind of invasive plants. So we set up this project, and she went out to her field site and came back and said, hey, my field site is covered in pawpaw trees, and none of them are producing any fruit. Can I do a project on why that is? And so I was like a bit taken aback, because we were supposed to be monitoring honeysuckle encroachment. I was like, well, yeah, sure, we can do that. But, you know, first question, what is a pawpaw and why should I care about them? So she took me out and she showed me pawpaw, and we did manage to find a couple of fruits, and I was immediately hooked on this crazy tree. And what started off as a small undergraduate research project has just grown arms and legs, thanks to the involvement of many people, not least those undergraduates who were with it right from the beginning, and more recently, a whole bunch of different collaborators that I just want to acknowledge straight up the beginning here. In particular, Sarah Francino, who is a master's student with myself and Joe Sheerans, who's in the Horton Crop Science Department. Joe is someone who actually knows about fruit, unlike me. Sarah did a great master's project and she's now doing a PhD with us as well. Brad Bergerford, another horticulturalist from OSU South Centers, has been closely involved, as has Ron Powell from the Ohio Pawpaw Growers Association, who's been so very supportive of all our work as we've got going. So just to continue in the line of saying thank you to people before we get going, I just want to make sure I acknowledge all of our funders there. We have funding from the Ohio Department of Agriculture. We've had funding from the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences here at OSU. And most recently, we're very excited to have received AFRI grant from the USDA, which is starting imminently. A whole bunch of other growers and supporters have been very helpful as well as all these folk listed down the bottom here who've helped with field work. And I want to give a particularly big shout out to Libby Brigner, who is the undergraduate student who's really responsible for all of this craziness. So without further ado, let me give you a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. We advertise this talk as about woodlands. We are going to stray a little bit away from woodlands to some of the other options for producing pawpaw that we're exploring, and I'll try to explain the reasons why we've moved out of the woodlands as well as still being interested in woodland production. But just as a brief outline, I'll give a brief overview for pawpaw. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them already, but for those who aren't, I'll just kind of outline what it is and why we care about them. We'll look at some of our initial research on things that control fruiting success and yield in forest, as well as in the orchards that we've been developing. We'll talk a little bit about potential economic returns from pawpaw production, and then think about some options for stand management going forward, how we might be able to increase production in woodlands. And I must kind of give a health warning up front that we're at the very early stages of this kind of stand manipulation work. So I'll try and give an overview of what we've been doing and why. But we're going to be waiting a year or two to get any really decent data on whether those manipulations have had any effect. Okay, so just as a brief overview to pawpaw, pawpaw is in the custard apple family. Scientific name there, Asimina triloba. This is pawpaw fruit on a tree. You've seen the flower already. It has these very beautiful, fleshy red flowers. It's unusual in its kind of pollination ecology in that it's primarily pollinated by things like flies and beetles and ladybugs, as opposed to by our normal pollinating insects. And those red fleshy flowers and their kind of musky odor is thought to be a evolutionary adaptation to mimic the scent and appearance of rotting flesh. And indeed, some producers do things like hanging roadkill in their trees to attract additional pollinators. But this is what the fruit looks like. It grows in these big clusters. Each of these clusters here emerges from a single flower with multiple pollinated ovaries. And the fruit is great in so many different ways. Pawpaw itself is spread right across the eastern United States, getting down into Georgia there, up into Ohio. We're kind of towards the northern end of its range here. It's in southern Michigan and even up into the really southern parts of Canada. But it's very widely distributed. That wide distribution is thought to be a combination of distribution by now extinct megafauna that ate the fruit and dispersed the seeds, as well as the role of indigenous peoples in dispersing it and cultivating it within our forests. And pawpaw is interesting because it, as well as kind of spreading by seed, it's highly clonal. So it grows in these dense patches or thickets that many of you will probably have come across. And so when I say it's clonal, what I mean is it spreads underground by its root network and puts up new little suckers. One of the reasons we were interested in, as a restorationist initially, is it's pretty good actually at suppressing some invasive species like honeysuckle, partly because its clonal habit allows it to draw on the resources of adult trees, and then its suckers can shoot up through the honeysuckle canopy, and then the deep shade that it casts is good at suppressing the honeysuckle. But those clonal patches also present problems for reproduction and fruit production, as we'll see later on. If you've never eaten a pawpaw fruit, this is what they look like inside. You cut them open, they've got these kind of lima-sized beans, seeds in the middle, lima bean-sized seeds in the middle, brown, fleshy. The textures can be really pretty variable. It can be quite firm when they're only just ripe, but you leave them a couple of days and they're going to be like a sort of custardy texture. And actually, we've done a lot of work on fruit quality and fruit characteristics, which I'm not going to talk about today, but the hardness, the fleshiness, the flavor, the color, the size of the fruit all varies pretty dramatically across the wide variety of different varietals that are available now, as well as within wild woodland stands where the quality of the fruit can be very variable indeed. There's a lot of kind of emerging pawpaw products. Jackie O's pawpaw wheat beer has grown in popularity. You can find that throughout Ohio during the right time of year at the moment. There's a market growing for kind of frozen pawpaw pulp. Here, this is a product from Integration Acres. I'm giving a bit of a shout out to both of these folks because they've been very supportive of our research. Yeah, there's a growing market for kind of shipping pawpaw by mail. The challenges of that associated with the soft character of the fruit. It's easily bruised and damaged. Flavor-wise, if you've never eaten a pawpaw, gosh, it's hard to describe. It's kind of, people just describe it as tropical, which is suitably vague, but it's kind of a mixture of sort of pineapple and mango and banana. And as you let it ripen, it develops these kind of deeper caramel type flavors. So it's a very variable fruit in its flavor, useful in baking and in all kinds of different products. So there's this growing market that we know is there for pawpaw products and a lot of consumer interest. When you see pawpaws for sale in farmers markets, they sell out rapidly. We've had fruit growers associations and fruit buyers like San Felipe, who helped us with our work, are very interested in getting their hands on pawpaw. The pawpaw beer is really been expanding to the extent that many breweries are finding it difficult to get the quantities of pawpaw they need for their product. So the demand is there. The issue is that the industry hasn't been able to meet the supply up until, well, it still can't meet the supply. So we need to find ways of stimulating the pawpaw economy and improving production. So we think that there's a market here that could help rural farmers and forest managers supplement their incomes by harvesting and improving the quality of wild patches. So we need to do a lot of research though to get productivity up to where it needs to be. We need to understand how pawpaw grows in different settings and what the fundamental controls on fruit production are. And so that's what we've been working on for the first few years. So let's talk about that initially, controls on yield. That's where the majority of our work in Woodlands has been focused up until this point. And we've got some early results, which are, we think they're interesting. Hope you do too. So for the last, well, gosh, it's coming on for 6 years now. It'll be 6 years this year. We've been monitoring fruit productivity at 5 different sites across Ohio. 2 of them here in Columbus on OSU property at the OSU Wetlands Center alongside the Olentangy River, and the woodlot at Waterman Farm in the middle of Columbus. But also at 3 sites down in southern Ohio, in the kind of Appalachian foothills there, which is the real kind of stronghold of pawpaw production, I suppose. So we have a monitoring at OSU Piketon at the South Center site, and then through 2 of our grower collaborators, Foxpaw Farm, which is operated by Ron Powell, who heads up the Ohio Pawpaw Growers Association, and then Integration Acres just outside Athens. So big thanks to those folks who've been working with us for a long time on this. So what goes on in these woodlands in terms of fruit production? Well, overall, what we're looking at here in this figure is the mean number of fruit that we're finding kind of year to year at these sites. And the immediate thing that stands out is that 2016 and 2017 Integration Acres were really super productive years, and that site overall, on average, tends to be a lot more productive than the others, and we'll talk about why that is in a moment. What this kind of hides, what the super production at Integration Acres hides, is that there's actually pretty significant variation in the number of fruit being produced from year to year. Now, some of that is to do with variations in weather conditions. So, for example, we know that 2018 and 2019 we had some poor conditions which weren't particularly conducive to great reproduction. You know, where we get these sort of late frosts that kill the flowers, that can really impact production pretty significantly. But the interesting trend that's emerging, at least at Waterman Farm and the wetlands at Piketon, we started monitoring a little bit later here, is you can see that there's this kind of cycling from year to year, where we kind of have like good years followed by a bad year, good years followed by a bad year. 2019 we had poor production, and 2020 was kind of low as well. We need a lot more data, but what we do know is that some tree fruits actually, especially where they're stressed in one way or another, can do this thing called biennial bearing, right? Where they actually only invest in reproduction and fruit production every other year. So you get we see this in apples in particular. It's noted in that, where you'll get bumper years followed by dips. So there's a challenge immediately, is how we can manage across this variation in productivity from year to year. Again, we note that our grower site here at Foxpaw Farm seems to have consistently higher production. We're not quite seeing those peaks and troughs as much at Foxpaw as we are at some of these less managed woodlands. And again, we'll talk about why that is in a second. So we have all this variability. It's varying from year to year. That might be to do with biennial bearing. It's possibly partly to do with weather conditions. We're still digging into this. What about what controls whether or not a tree produces any fruit to begin with? Because one of the things we find in these sites is that when we go and monitor these woodland patches, the vast majority of trees actually produce no fruit at all. Maybe only one or two. Within each patch, within each site, there's most of this production is accounted for by a smaller number of highly productive trees. So we're interested in trying to understand what that's all about. So this figure here is trying to get at some of that, and I know it's a little bit confusing with all of these crazy number of dots here, but what we're basically looking at is the probability of a tree producing any fruit at all, as described here on this vertical axis. So as we go from the bottom to the top, we increase the probability that a tree will produce fruit. So each of these dots here is an individual tree that we monitored. Actually, each dot might correspond to multiple observations of the same tree in different years. But each of these is kind of an observation of a tree in a particular year. And so one of the first things we find is, unsurprisingly, the probability of producing a fruit is controlled by the size of the tree, right? So trees take a while to come into reproductive maturity. Your small little understory, shrubby sized trees in the forest are never really going to produce any fruit. And we see a lot of those kinds of patches in our woodlands, at least, these little pawpaw patches, and the trees are maybe only 4 to 6 feet tall. They're extremely unlikely to produce fruit. The other thing we see, though, is that there's a clear separation in terms of the productivity in stands that have a predominantly closed canopy versus stands that have a predominantly open canopy. So the closed canopy stands are shown in blue here, and here's kind of the sort of the average over all of these different sites. So to get like an 80% probability of producing a fruit in a closed stand, the tree needs to have a diameter of at least 3 inches. So it needs to be really pretty big before it's likely to produce any fruit. If we compare that with an open canopy stand, though, well, to get the same probability of producing a fruit, that 80% probability of a tree producing any fruit at all, the tree now only needs to be 1.5 inches in diameter. And this pattern has been consistent from year to year, and it's pretty consistent across sites that we see this, this strong effect of the age of the tree, the size of the tree, and this effect of canopy openness. And it's this canopy openness that's actually what's differentiating those grower sites of Integration Acres and Foxpaw Farm from the sites on OSU properties, because the Integration Acres site and Foxpaw Farm both have wild stands that have had one or more kinds of management, including opening up of the forest canopy to allow increased light availability and thinning of the pawpaw stems themselves, as well as all kinds of other things. So Integration Acres, for example, the owner grazes goats underneath his pawpaw trees with a kind of sort of silvopastoral agroforestry type system, and he's fertilized a bit, and he's grafted in some varietal trees too, as has the owner at Foxpaw Farm, where there's varietal trees planted in amongst some of those open stands. So there's multiple things going on here to do with the ways in which the stand are being managed, but there seems to be this fundamental relationship between light availability and reproductive effort, as well as this effect of stem size. So that led us to a lot of what we've done next in terms of manipulating these stands, which has been about trying to allow the pawpaw trees in those plots to grow on to larger sizes, to be big enough and mature enough to produce fruit, as well as opening up and reducing competition in the understory to increase light availability. Light is obviously, one of the fundamental controls on photosynthesis, which is where plants get their energy. And you've seen those big pawpaw fruit, right? That's a huge energy investment for the tree. And one of the things we tend to find is that although we have done a little work on pollination, when we follow the flowers through the kind of, from, initial flower set through to fruit production, actually quite a lot of those flowers are pollinated, and we see the early development of individual little fruit. But then what happens is the tree begins to abort them, and a lot of fruit are lost through this process of early abortion, which is probably because the tree's limiting its energy investment in trying to grow all these massive fruit, and it just concentrates them in one or two fruit in these kind of shady conditions in the understory. So to summarize, big trees better, open canopy and more light availability better. Probably two unsurprising results there, but it's giving us the evidence base on which to justify going in and manipulating forest stands. I mentioned pollination a little bit. As I say, we do get more fruit being pollinated and starting that kind of development process than eventually reach it at the end. But we have done a little bit of work on pollination, particularly because within these wild stands, we have these clonal patches. And essentially what that means is that, and there's been some interesting work on pawpaws done at Kentucky State University, who've done a huge amount of research on pawpaw production. They've got a whole extension program focused on pawpaws, so do check out their website. It's really great. But these clonal patches, right, the trees in them, not always, but sometimes those patches can, the individual trees are actually all genetically identical to one another. They're all suckers off one individual parent tree. And it's believed that in the vast majority of cases, these genetically identical trees will not successfully pollinate one another. So the pawpaw are described as not self-sterile, but self-unfruitful, because there's very limited success when the trees are pollinating one another if they're identical. So we were interested in this idea of pollination limitation and self-unfruitfulness, and we've begun to explore it a little bit, and we'll be doing some more work on it in the next couple of years. And we did this using a kind of pollen transfer experiment, and this is Libby here, Libby Brigner, who was responsible for starting all of this, and she did this really interesting little pilot experiment for us. what you can see Libby doing here is collecting pollen out of the flowers, and we're going to transfer that pollen around the site. So we have our two sites, right? Waterman Farm and Olentangy Wetlands here in Columbus. And within each of those sites, we have multiple different pawpaw plots. So what we did is collect pollen from a tree and then transfer it within plots. So here, for example, here's a tree, a donor tree that we're taking pollen from, and we're using it to pollinate another tree in the same patch. So again, a tree that's likely to be genetically similar, or if not genetically identical to the tree we've taken the pollen from. We then took pollen from another tree in another patch. So these are widely separated patches. So we went to another part of the same site, took pollen and pollinated another flower on that same tree. And then finally, we collected pollen from another site, which is a couple of miles away, and used it to pollinate the same tree. So what we're trying to set up here, right, is a gradient of genetic dissimilarity in the donor pollen that we're using to pollinate this tree. So here's Libby collecting pollen, and you can see here on the branch we've got a little pollination bag, which is being used to cover up those flowers and exclude natural pollinators that might mess up our experiment by bringing pollen from elsewhere. And so we left those bags on. Here they are, multiple flowers on this tree covered up with these cheesecloth pollination bags, and we followed the fruit through over time. So here you can see we've removed the bag, and you can see the young fruit developing here. So we went back afterwards and collected some of these and monitored what happened. So here, for example, is a bag that we've opened up, and the flower's fallen off, and there's no sign of fruit production. So we were able to track whether or not the fruit whether or not the flowers produce fruit, whether or not they were successfully pollinated, and then whether or not they actually went through as far as producing a mature fruit. Here's a bag that we forgot about, and you can see the pawpaw has actually grown on, matured, and split the bag open as it's grown. So what did we actually find there? So when we used pollen from a different site, we successfully got 8 fruit developed on average. When we used pollen from a different plot, it was slightly less. And when it was from a different, interestingly, when it was from a different tree in the same plot, it was more similar to pollen from the same site. So what we were seeing is that consistently, when we use pollen from a different site, so a widely separated location in the landscape, we actually increased the number of fruit that we ended up with. This is like really small pilot data, something we want to explore in a lot more detail. And ideally, we'd like to do that alongside some genetic understanding of the trees that we're taking it from as well. So it could be, for example, that in the different tree situation here, we weren't dealing with like fully clonal plots, so that the trees within a plot were actually genetically different from one another. So lots more we need to do here, but there is a hint that there might be some pollen limitation, self-unfruitfulness going on. Okay, so we talked a bit there about potential limitations and controls on production, a combination of light availability, the size of the trees, the kind of the strange pollen syndrome of these pollination syndrome of these trees, reliant on not particularly efficient pollinators, and also this issue of self-unfruitfulness. The next thing I'll give you an overview then is of how we've taken this information and used it to try and make some decisions about how to intervene in stands. The main thing that we've been doing, and as I warned you at the beginning, this is really early days, is trying to reduce competition in the understory. So this is one of the plots, for example. This is at Integration Acres, one of the woodland plots, not the nice open agroforestry plot the owner has. And here the pawpaw are really competing with like very dense cover of spice bush, a really large. Some of these spice bushes are almost like trees. They're incredibly large. I've never seen any as big as these. So we went in there and tried to reduce the competition, remove this dense competition of primarily of spicebush, but there was also multiflora in there. There was also grapevine and climbing honeysuckle, which was climbing up the pawpaw trees and kind of covering them over, in some cases snapping, damaging, and bending them. So we tried to clear it out and increase light availability. So that's essentially what all of our manipulations have been about at present. It's about increasing light availability, and potentially with this increasing opening up of the canopy, it would be interesting down the line to also evaluate, whether opening up the canopy actually increases, the ability of pollinators to find flowers and move around within these sites. And so we'd be interested in looking at pollinator abundance as well. There was a nice win-win on this site because actually the owner also makes spicebush tea. So he got a lot of spicebush harvested for him. So there's, pawpaw aren't the only non-timber forest product out there that you could be thinking about if you're interested in, making money, making your management of your forest pay. That was it beforehand. This is what it looked afterwards. You can see here again is this spicebush dominated understory in the background. You can see just how much we've opened up the plot. We've not really taken out any trees here. Most of this is dead ash snags that we took down because we've had a lot of issues in our experimental plots of dead ash coming down and squashing all our poor little pawpaw trees. So we cleared that up. So not only did the owner get spicebush, he also got all this firewood stacked. So hopefully, there's a win-win sometimes between research and forest management. This is Sarah Francino, the master's now PhD student who's leading all this work. So we've really opened things up there, and we're going to be tracking over the next couple of years whether or not this opening up effect has improved production. So we've kind of in each of the sites we've sort of opened up half of our plots and left half of them still encroached. So we've got a nice sort of before after control impact comparison that we can make. At some of our other sites, it's a similar process. The problems are just slightly different. So at the Olentangy wetlands, for example, the primary issue is honeysuckle encroachment. This is actually the site where all the research started. And interestingly enough, just as a little factoid, if you've never been to the Pawpaw Festival, you may not, down in Athens, you may not know that there's a best pawpaw competition every year. There's a biggest pawpaw and a best by flavor pawpaw competition. Actually, a number of years ago, one of the prize-winning pawpaws came out of the Olentangy wetlands. I wish I knew where that tree was, but unfortunately I don't. But there are some really great productive trees down here. So again, what we've been doing is clearing out that understory. It's mostly removing honeysuckle. You can see the ground looks pretty bare here. This is because this site is like right adjacent to the Olentangy River. So there's actually been a lot of flooding immediately before we went in there, and a lot of sediment deposition around these trees. But you can see we've opened it right up now, a lot more light availability. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And as a restorationist, this is what makes me excited, because if we can increase productivity in these stands that were formerly honeysuckle encroached, it's actually providing a means by which restoration and forest management can cover its costs. And so, there's the potential for things like pawpaw production to contribute to improving the ecological quality of our stands. Again, here's just one more example. Here's one of our plots at Waterman Farm. Again, not so honeysuckle invaded, but a pretty dense regeneration layer here of primarily mesic species. And we've gone in, we've opened it right up, we've removed that understory, we've limbed up some of the big canopy trees. So this was a beech that was casting a lot of shade in this plot. So we've not taken it out, but we've limbed it right up, raised the canopy to try and get some more light availability in there. So again, you can actually now see clearly where all those pawpaw trees are. In other areas, we've been making more kind of drastic interventions. So at Foxborough Farm, one of the sites we work on is had pretty significant cover of young maple trees right throughout the plot, and we really wanted to get some more light in there. So we've been taking some trees down. That was me being very proud of my felling, because I managed to. Well, I clipped the tops of the pawpaw trees, but we were pretty worried. You can see how dense the pawpaw are here. We managed to miss them. And actually, in this plot, this was one of these sites where we had those very, very dense kind of pawpaw thickets, right, with hundreds and hundreds of stems per acre here. And so we talked a lot about light availability. The other thing that we've been doing on sites like this, where the pawpaw is very, very dense, and you've got some intra-specific competition, right? The pawpaw are actually competing with one another for resources and light, is we've thinned the pawpaw stems out themselves pretty considerably. You can see a pile of them here stacked up, with the idea being that we can get a bit of growth release here, allow these pawpaw to grow on to larger sizes, have less competition amongst themselves, and hopefully, although we've got fewer stems, will increase the chances of individual trees producing some fruit. Because this was a patch that, you know, we would only ever get like 1 or 2 fruit out of this patch, just because it was so dense and so little light available. So, you know, other things, we've been thinning up the as well, raising it up, all about increasing light availability. That's me feeling cocky after dropping that maple tree and successfully dropping a branch onto my foot, which is quite painful. So do be careful if you are going to go out there and manipulate your stands. Okay, so we can increase light. We can also try to increase the quality of the trees that are in those plots, because as I mentioned previously, the quality of fruit in these forest stands is really highly variable. There can be anything from like the size of a little pebble to really pretty big, you know, approaching like a pound in weight. But the critical thing is, in terms of eating quality, they can be very variable as well. So some, you know, a good pawpaw, there's nothing better than it. But, you know, some of those fruit you pick out of Woodlands and you take a bite and it tastes like you're eating diesel. They can be really pretty unpleasant. So by grafting in varietals, commercial varietals, we hope to do a number of different things. One, produce, you know, high quality, have a number of trees in there that are producing high quality marketable fruit. Two is that these varieties are also, you know, on average, are going to be more productive than the wild species. And three, we're also enhancing genetic diversity within these potentially clonal stands by introducing genetically different material, which we hope will have the effect of stimulating productivity of the wild trees that are in the plots as well. So this is one of the grafts that Sarah did. I believe it was the variety we used here was sunflower. Okay, so that's a sense of how we manipulating these plots based on our understanding of the controls on pawpaw production at present. In addition to our work in the woods, we have also been looking into orchard production too. When we started doing this work, I kind of joked with Sarah in her defense, like, you know, what I don't want to get into is like a situation where we produce pawpaw and it's like producing a golden delicious, right? So the kind of philosophical question I wind Sarah up with is, you know, when does a pawpaw stop becoming a pawpaw? And if we produce it, so we've got 2 experimental orchards, if we produce it in a setting like this, so highly controlled, manipulated, open setting, does that mean, are we actually producing pawpaw anymore? Obviously we are producing a pawpaw fruit, but, you know, spiritually, culturally, lots of people, many people attraction to pawpaw is its status as a native non-timber forest product associated with low intensity production systems. And, you know, there's an interesting philosophical question about, you know, how that changes if we start really commercializing it in this way. But nevertheless, there is good reason to look into using open sites to establish pawpaw stands on. And so these experimental orchards we created, they have kind of 2 treatments across them. A high input treatment, which looks something like this, where we have a shade cloth down to reduce moisture loss from the soil. The trees are actually, and suppress weeds. The trees are actually irrigated underneath the shade cloth as well. You can see that a number of the trees we've also encased in shade enclosures. That's because pawpaw are believed to be somewhat susceptible to UV scorch, UV damage when they're planted out in full sun, at least initially. So we were investigating whether that's true or not, because there's some debate about whether, you know, the scorching and browning of leaves we see in open grown pawpaw is to actually to do with UV damage, or whether it's really just to do with moisture stress and the limited ability to maintain that moisture status. So we've been looking at that a little bit in these systems too. And so why would we want to move into these production systems using this is using kind of commercially developed cultivars, of which there's a rapidly growing number. This is a bit of a messy graph, but it speaks to, it's kind of early data, hot off the press here, but it speaks to some of the reason why we're interested in commercial varietal productions in orchard settings, as well as introducing some commercial varieties into woodlands. So what we're looking at here is the relationship between the size of the fruit and the mass of its fruit. And unsurprisingly, what we find is that bigger fruit are heavier, right? Which is good, important from a marketing point of view. We want to establish these relationships so we can rapidly estimate yield in the field without having to harvest, take all the fruit off the tree, take them back to the lab and weigh them. That's why we produce these graphs. But the kind of interesting thing to think about here from a production point of view is if you look at the distribution of these species, these are wild fruit. The range of sizes and weights is really pretty big. But when you compare that to cultivars, look how the wild fruit are really kind of clustered down here in the sort of 50, sort of 25 to 175 gram range, whereas our cultivar fruit from these commercial cultivars, they're much more distributed in the sort of 125 to 300 gram range. I'm sorry that these are in metric units. That's scientists for you. But when we are looking at cultivars produced in orchard, we are getting bigger and better fruit, and we're also getting consistently high quality fruit. But what we're interested in finding out is, just how much we have to baby these orchard trees in order to get good establishment of the trees themselves, and then further on down the line, once they've matured and grown on a little bit, how these different management regimes of this high input with weed suppression and irrigation, we're comparing that to basically giving the trees hell, where we just sort of plant them and leave them. And we call that our low input treatment. So right now, the orchards are pretty young. They've been in for just a couple of years, but we have got some information on differences in survival. We've got our two different sites here, Piketon and Columbus. And what we tend to find is that seedling trees, so we planted in two different broad stock types. So either wild grown, grown from seedlings, they're not grafted. They tend to have consistently higher survival. It was a bit different in 2020. There were some strange things going on in Piketon in 2020 with the weather, in 2019 with the weather. We tend to see consistently higher survival of the seedling trees in both in the high input and in the low input. The grafted trees tend to have lower survival, and we think that's a symptom of moisture stress in these grafted trees, where obviously, I'm sure you all know what grafting is, right? So we cut the stem to have a rootstock, and onto that we can graft our particular cultivar. That's what allows us to get our consistent fruit by having those genetically identical grafts of a particular variety. They do the same thing in apples and plums and pears and any kind of tree fruit, right? So the question we were asking is, if we just want to establish the orchard, is it better to plant in the grafted stock, which is comparatively expensive? You're talking about $30 to $40 per tree, whereas we can get seedling trees for about less than $1. We buy them wholesale, and then we could graft onto them later once the rootstocks are actually established, and we can buy the scion wood for about $5 a tree. So we're interested in trying to find out what's the most economically efficient method of establishing the orchards. Even more interestingly, when we looked at, this is just data for one site at the moment, when we looked at variation in a little bit more detail in survival, we actually had two different kinds of grafted stock. Some of it was delivered to us bare roots, and some of it was delivered to us as container stock. And actually between these two different these are from different suppliers, and interestingly, the folk who supply it to us bare root, they tend to put their grafts pretty high up on the rootstock, so at least a kind of foot above the root collar, whereas the container stock is grafted pretty close down to the root collar. And we think that's interesting. And what we tend to see is that the bare root trees actually have consistently worse survival than the container stock trees. Now that might be to do with root stress during outplanting. It might be to do with the position of that graft, which is also going to have an effect on moisture stress. But there's more here that we're going to follow up on. But if you are interested in outplanting trees and developing pawpaw patches or planting trees into your woodlands, at present, we do recommend using container stock and ensuring that that folk have, that if it's a grafted tree, that graft is lower rather than higher on the tree. That seems to improve survival. So you see that here. So a high input system consistently had higher survival. So irrigation seems to improve survival. And our seedling rootstock, again, had the highest survival rates, but containers amongst the grafted materials, container stock was better than bare rootstock. And that seems to carry through into the growth of the trees as well. So this is the kind of relative growth over the few years that we've had the trees in the woodlands. Here's our high input treatment. Here's our low input treatment. You can see that on average, the trees are growing a little bit more vigorously in the high input compared to in the low input. And again, we see this kind of gradient where in the high input, the seedling and the container stock trees are performing better. They're growing on better than the bare root trees, which seem to be pretty stressed. Less of a trend in the low input, where, as I said, we're kind of giving them hell. So they're all a little bit stressed. They're surviving for the first couple of years, probably investing a lot in their below ground root network. And then hopefully we'll see them shoot on as time goes by. Okay, so in all of this, we have got our aim to generate, to develop a system, whether it's in woodlands or in orchards, that's going to provide growers with an economic return. We haven't done a huge amount of work on this at the moment, and indeed our AFRI grant, which is led by Gil Signori in the Department of Hort and Crop Sciences. He's an agricultural economist. We're going to be looking at a lot at the kind of value chain of the pawpaw production system and trying to enhance its marketability and its profitability. But based on our initial data and what we know about the kind of returns, the kind of sale value you can get for pawpaw products, we've been able to do a little bit of a back of the envelope calculation. So this is for woodland production. So this is estimated on the base that we've got about, tend to average about 900 fruiting trees per acre. And I should say that this is like per acre of pawpaw patch, not per acre of woodland, right? So you need to have an acre's worth of pawpaw patch, which might be over many acres of your woodland. We're taking an average wild fruit weight of about 0.2 pounds. And of that, about 50% of that wild fruit is going to be pulp. The rest of it's going to be seeds and skin. And again, that's another reason actually to look at commercial varietals rather than wild fruit, because we tend to see much better ratios of total fruit weight to pulp weight in those commercial varietals. They have far fewer, but they're bigger fruit overall, but they have far fewer seeds, which makes, you know, if you're, one of the big things that people want to pay for is pulp, right? So so getting a better pulp to total mass ratio is important. And in terms of the crop value, wholesale, if you're taking it to a processor, you're probably going to get you know, just the fruit picked off the tree. In recent years, you're probably going to get about $1 per pound. If you're selling at market, kind of farmers market type situation for the unprocessed fruit, you're going to be getting about $3 per pound. And if you're selling the processed pulp, the current kind of going rate for that is about $8 per pound. And this is kind of what the numbers look like. And what we've factored in here is the labor costs associated with harvesting the fruit, transporting the fruit, and if necessary, processing it. And this is our kind of economic return per acre. So wholesale per acre, about $180 per acre, all the way up to $730 per acre if you're selling processed pulp, although I do make the note there that we haven't included infrastructure and equipment costs in that. Obviously, if you're going to set up a processing system, there's going to be an economic cost up front. So, you know, the intermediate thing here of taking your fruit to a farmer's market, you could be making about $500 per acre. So it's not massive amounts of money at present. We think we can enhance this value chain there, but it's certainly a better rate of economic return than corn and soy. So, you know, we're comparing favorably with those ag crops. But, you know, it's a way of generating a reasonable amount of money for small woodlot owners that could be reinvested in woodland management. Unfortunately, you know, that's the market value. When you factor in the net value of transportation and labor, the net returns aren't looking so great at the moment. It's really only the farmer's market that ends up giving us a positive net return on investment. Again, we get a higher value product here, but the labor costs, the amount of time invested in processing the pulp, you know, dings us quite a lot. And likewise, the low economic value of selling direct to a wholesale dings us once we take into account the costs of harvesting and transport. And that's really why we need to make, you know, if we want woodland production to be profitable, we really have to up the productivity. The low net returns here are a symptom of the fact that most of our woodland trees just aren't producing very many fruit. So to get this into a profitable system, we're going to have to do a lot of work to find out how we can increase productivity and the quality of the fruit that we're getting out of woodlands. If you're interested in orchard production, I've got a brief comparison here. It varies a lot with the different varieties. So this is across 6 different orchard producers that Sarah surveyed as part of her master's. The number of fruit per tree varied really substantially with different varieties. So you can see some varieties like Lynn's Favorite and Wells and Wilson produce a lot of fruit, others rather fewer. And depending on the system that you produce, the kind of blue colors here means you're turning a profit. The red colors indicate you're making a loss. So you can see that once you get into the farmer's market situation with orchard production, where productivity of the trees is much higher, and we're producing high quality, high mass fruit, right, from some of these commercial varietals, then we're much more likely to turn a profit in these kind of open grown orchard systems. So that's one of the reasons, again, for trying to increase light availability. If we can get woodland stand production closer to where we're seeing it in orchard systems, we're more likely to be able to develop an economically viable system. So to wrap this up then, and hopefully we've got plenty of time left here for questions. Our work has shown that fruit production in wild stands is really highly variable between sites and between years. There's maybe some evidence of biennial bearing there, but overall, you know, that big variability between sites, we can largely ascribe to differences in the structure of the pawpaw patches, the sizes of the trees, and light availability. If we're going to get an economically viable production system from wild sands, we're going to have to develop management practices that improve productivity. We believe at present that light availability is key, that there might be benefits in considering hand pollinating with genetically distinct pollen. There will be an additional cost for labor enhancing that, and that it's worth thinking about grafting and supplemental planting of varietals to enhance genetic diversity in woodland patches, as well as to introduce highly productive, high quality fruit into the system. Orchard production, it's an economically viable system already, albeit you've got to select the right tree and know what your production system is going to be. It looks like our high input systems where we're reducing moisture stress through irrigation, increased survival. And we recommend irrigating, using shade cloth early on to protect trees from scorch, and using container stock or grafting in situ to enhance survival and growth in the early years. And these things probably apply equally if you're going to invest significant monies in introducing commercial varietals into your woodlands, albeit that the shade cloth would be less of an issue. The interesting thing I think about it, just to wrap up as another note, is, you know, if we're thinking about management of our forests more generally, and as a restorationist, I try to do that, is that we know that our forests in Ohio are changing through this process of mesification, where we're getting encroachment of the understory, increasing amounts of shade, a switch from oak and hickory dominated forests with high economic value, high wildlife value, to more mesic species dominated woodlands, which have lower value for wildlife and are maybe less resilient to climate change too. The exciting thing is that, you know, something that we're going to be tracking now, we've manipulated these stands, is that, you know, if we're increasing light availability in these woodlands, will we actually also, alongside enhancing pawpaw production, enhance the recruitment of desirable hardwood trees too? And it might be that we can, you know, over the really long term, design some kind of process of shifting cultivation of pawpaw around in woodlands to open up, enhance pawpaw production. That helps pay for the costs of woodland management. We get oak production, you know, enhance oak regeneration, then maybe pawpaw production can move on to another stand part of the forest as the woodland trees grow up. I mean, maybe that's pie in the sky, but it's the, you know, it's an interesting thing to consider. If you have questions, obviously happy to chat more now, but here's some contacts for you. If you want to talk about woodland production, then please feel free to give me a shout. Email's best for everybody at present because we're all working from home. Sarah Francino, who's done so much of this work really in the field, she is your pawpaw guru. Do feel free to contact her. If you've got particular questions about assessing fruit quality, Joe is a great person to talk to. And Brad is our orchard production mentor and is you know, leads a lot of the extension work related to this program. So feel free to reach out to any of us, and we'll point you in the right direction, even if we can't answer your question ourselves. And then finally, just to say, the Ohio Pawpaw Growers Association are a wonderful resource. They've got all kinds of fact sheets, their newsletters full of information. They're a great community, very supportive if you're interested in getting into pawpaw growing. So do consider joining the Ohio Pawpaws Growers Association and getting involved in all the great work that they do. And I'll leave it there. Happy to take questions.
Okay, Matt. Well, you've got over 50 questions sitting in the Q&A. So
okay, here we go.
Let's get started. Jan asks, market-wise, do you think the interest is a fad, or might marketing be sustainable for some years?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Certainly, you know, there was a surge of popularity and interest in them in the last couple of years. So, you know, not to be too rude, but, you know, there was a bit of a kind of hipster explosion in interest in pawpaw. And particularly because if you don't know about it, a guy called Andrew Moore wrote a really great book on pawpaw, which also attracted a lot of attention and a lot of press. I was worried about that a couple of years ago when Andrew's book came out and there was this kind of real interest in it. But I think it's sustainable. If you look at the numbers of people attending the Ohio Pawpaw Festival, the development of pawpaw festivals all across the country, we've seen continued sustained interest in pawpaw, and I think that we have a real opportunity here.
Okay. Melissa asks, is the site at the OSU Wetlands accessible for people to take a look at what the patch looks like, or is it possible to meet out there at a day and time in the spring?
Yes, we'd be happy to meet with people, COVID notwithstanding. But yeah, the site in the wetlands is accessible. In fact, it's so accessible that people regularly go and take all our pawpaw, which makes counting them interesting. But if you're in Columbus and you know where the wetland center is, if you kind of park in the car park there and walk down into the woods, there's a trail, kind of a trail through the woods that runs right alongside the river. And if you walk that trail, you will come to some strange openings in the forest where it looks like an alien spacecraft has landed and moved all the vegetation. And that's us. So you'll be able to see the stands that we've opened up really pretty easily. It's actually pretty neat to go and see them. We cleared a few of them, a couple of them last year, and we saw some really nice response from the woodland ground flora. which was pretty cool. So we'll be monitoring that as well. The ones that we haven't cleared are a little bit more difficult to see, but the trees are kind of tagged and flagged. So if you see strange pink ribbons hanging off pawpaw trees in the woods, that's us as well. So you can go and take a look.
Okay. Robert asks, is anyone doing high tunnel growing?
Gosh, not that I know of. Not that I know of. Pawpaw, they're pretty resilient, and they actually need like a kind of cool period to ensure they set fruit well. If you look at that map of the range, you'll see that although the same genus has other species which are found, down in Florida itself. Pawpaw isn't distributed particularly far south, so it is although it's kind of tropical looking, it's definitely a temperate species. Whether I don't know what would happen in a high tunnel situation. That's an interesting question. That's a good one. That'd be a good one for Brad. I'm not a horticulturalist.
Actually, Brad just answered
there you
in
go.
the chat. Let's see if I can pull that one up.
Brad's here. Hello, Brad. Nice to know there's somebody listening that knows more than you do.
Brad says you would need a tall tunnel, but hope to replicate our hardy fig tunnel research on Pawpaw at Piketon. So let's see. Kurt asks, how about more manual pollination for increasing yields? You talked a little bit about that.
Yeah, we talked about that. That's something that we're going to be working on actually in the next couple of years. We did that little pilot study, and then I kind of focus shifted a little bit, and we didn't have the time to follow it up. But we are definitively going to look at how whether hand pollination improves fruiting success. But the big question, of course, right? Remember, is we actually see quite a lot of fruit set in these trees, right? I don't think that fruit set is necessarily the issue. What the problem is that most of those things, you see these tiny little fruit develop and then they just fall off again, right? And I think that that's a resource stress situation rather than necessarily being pollination limitation. Whether if we bump fruit set up even further with hand pollination, we get a few more fruit, we'll find out. But yeah, we're looking into that. Okay.
Jan asks, what is minimal number of trees one could plant in a starter orchard?
So if you're going to plant trees you want at least 2 trees, right, of different varieties if you're going to plant them in your backyard, because of that genetic incompatibility thing. So you can get trees, you can get fruit with just 2 trees. I've got 3 in my front yard here. They look like they're going to flower for the first time this spring, so I'm pretty excited about that. But yeah, I mean, also there are people with 1 tree in their garden around where I live here in Columbus, and they do get fruit on them. So there is pollen dispersal, but you could plant 1 tree and go and collect pollen from somewhere else in the woods and pollinate your tree. So.
And that's what Michael asks, is when do you collect the pollen?
Yeah, it's a good question. So their phenology is actually quite early. You saw that picture that Kathy showed at the beginning, and you can see the flowers have actually emerged before the leaves. So they'll be flowering kind of March and April time. And I haven't really gone into this, but the flowers are weird. Everything about pawpaw is weird. The flowers, because they don't emerge synchronously. They're slightly sort of asynchronous on the tree.
Right.
And the other issue is, and they're not necessarily synchronous between different trees in the patch as well. And the reason for that, although the flowers have both male and female parts, but at the point at which the trees start producing pollen, by that point, the female part of the flower is no longer receptive to receiving pollen, right? So it's actually it's actually quite tricky. So you need to wait a little while so the flowers have opened, and when some of the early ones are beginning pollen, then you can start hand pollinating. But if you leave it too long, then they're not receptive anymore. We should do a workshop on hand pollination in the spring. We've got plans to do some grafting workshops, but we should run a workshop on hand pollination.
Yeah. Perry asks, what measurable standard did you use to distinguish open canopy sites from closed canopy sites with regard to chances of fruiting? How open is open?
So open in that analysis meant no more than about 40% canopy cover. And one of the at that point, when we did that analysis, at that point, we only really had 2 open stands, right? So this was prior to us doing any manipulation. And one of those stands was completely open, completely open. One of them was about 40%. We didn't see too much difference between them.
Sandy asked, to increase pollination by hand, how long does pollen survive and how should it be stored? So you do need to do a pollen workshop.
Yeah, I cannot answer that question. That would be a good one for the Ohio Pawpaw Growers Association. When we've done hand pollination, we have collected pollen and applied it on the same day.
Okay. Judy asked, what soil types do pawpaws prefer?
Well, our sites, they grow on all kinds of different soil types. The Foxpaw farm there, you see, that's kind of on a ridge top down in southern Ohio. They're really pretty thin, stony soils. But all the way through to down next to the Olentangy River on riparian deep loamy soil. So yeah, I guess their natural distribution, I would suggest, is a little bit more mesic in woodlands. They tend to be associated with the kind of wetter areas of the forest, but you can get them to grow just about anywhere.
Yeah, usually in your woodlands, you find them in that bottomland area, not necessarily standing water areas, but up a little bit where they got plenty of moisture in the understory. So
yeah, they don't seem to be like extensive periods of inundation, but occasional flooding like we get at the wetlands center, they're fine. And some of those heavier soils, they do fine. I think you probably can overwater them and stress them out. We might have an issue with that in some places. Certainly in some of our plots where there's like long periods of standing water, there aren't any trees in those locations within the plots. But yeah, if you plant them, you can get them to grow pretty much anywhere.
Robert asks, do the colonized trees develop long tap roots?
They do have a pretty big tap root. Yes. Yes. Yeah. And so if you're trying to grow pawpaw on from seed to plant out, we recommend using one of those long tree plots. Oh my goodness, tree plots, right? The kind of tall pots, because when the seed germinates, actually you'll plant the seed and you'll be waiting for it to emerge, and you'll think nothing's going to happen. Like, be patient with them. They actually take a long time to emerge above ground, because the first thing they do is send down this really big taproot. So a couple of recommendations, and this is a tangent inspired by that question, but a couple of recommendations. If you're going to grow them in pots to plant them out, make sure the plots are up above the ground, even if you're using those big long tree pots, because the taproot will come straight out of the bottom. So if you get them up above the ground and they'll air prune, and they'll actually put out a lot more kind of fibrous side roots. And they are actually pretty susceptible to root shock and root damage. If you ever look at the roots, they're kind of strange. They're not particularly woody. They're kind of slightly fleshy, and they can be easily damaged. And where we've had issues where, we've learned a lot and made a lot of mistakes. So, we had like a bunch of pawpaw seedlings that were grown in pots that we were going to plant out, and the roots went down through the bottom of the tree pot, and we pulled them up and moved them, and man, they all died. They did not like that. so yeah, respect the taproot.
Leah asked, how did you clear the understory? Is it a continual process over years with new growth?
So the clearing we did was just all manual. We it varied a bit from site to site. So where we had the honeysuckle dominated understory, when we cleared that, we chainsawed it all out, hauled the slash away, and we used glyphosate on the cut stumps to ensure the honeysuckle didn't come back. It's probably going to reinvade because we only cleared small areas, so we will have to keep on top of managing it. In the area that I showed you where it was all spicebush dominated, we just cut it down. We didn't want to kill it. yeah, so that will require like continued management because it's just going to resprout.
Yeah. Thomas wants to know how many trees are located at these different sites.
Thomas, were you talking about the orchards or in our wild plots? I guess I can answer both. In our orchards, God, Brad's going to kill me for not knowing this off the top of my head. I'm trying to think. We probably have, well, there's several hundred trees across both of those orchards, or a mixture of varietals and seedling trees. In our monitoring plots, it varies really widely. From a dozen or so larger trees. We've got some plots that have just enormous trees in them and relatively few, to like that site I showed you at Pawpaw Farm, where it's extremely dense with 70, 80, 90 trees in that kind of what's like 60-foot diameter plot that we set up, and we in those areas we've thinned them out pretty considerably.
So to that, Michael asks, when you're thinning, what's your density goal?
Yeah, that's a good question. I knew someone was going to ask me that. We do have one, and I cannot remember it off the top of my head. So that would be a good question to follow up on. I'm sorry, I can't recall that off the top of my head.
I will say
at Piketon, we have 320 trees across the. So we have in the orchards, there's 320 trees at Piketon and 320 at Waterman.
Okay.
Thank you, Brad. Bad at remembering numbers. I'm sorry, people. That's not the way my brain works.
Warren asks, have you done any DNA fingerprinting to document the amount of genetic diversity within and among plots and sites?
We haven't done that for our plots, but there's a great paper on it produced by the folk at Kentucky State University looking at exactly that. Yeah, and their conclusions were that some but not all patches are purely clonal.
Okay. Anthony wants to know, is there a significant risk of introducing disease via grafting cultivars into wild stands?
Good question. There's not too many diseases of pawpaw that we're worried about at the moment. The big one that affects it at present is a fungal disease, Phyllosticta, which can damage fruit quality. That's a problem in some of our orchard settings where we're growing them at high density. You do see Phyllosticta in the woodlands, but it seems to be less prevalent. That's a question that I would like to investigate. Yeah, there's a few other. It's emerging area of research, the kind of whole pawpaw disease. There's a couple of. I don't think it's not really been studied. There's a few other diseases that are emerging, like black spot is a kind of newly noticed disease in some orchards. So there is the potential for that. But most of those kind of fungal diseases can probably be managed by good cultural practices and ensuring that you're bringing in, if you're grafting in stock, that you're removing diseased leaves and materials and not letting them accumulate.
Jason wants to know, we ought to throw this one at Marnie. When grafting in woodlands, have any measures been taken to deter damage from deer?
We have had a little bit of damage. The biggest damage that we get from deer is actually them rubbing their antlers on the pawpaw trees. Interestingly, I don't know if other people have the same experience. I don't see massive amounts of browsing damage to pawpaw. I think they're pretty heavily avoided. Indeed, I mentioned the site we have where the owner runs goats underneath his pawpaw orchard, and they don't touch those trees. And if goats won't touch them, then nothing.
Deer definitely won't.
So if you've ever taken a pawpaw leaf and kind of crushed it up, it has that real chemical kind of gasoline type smell. So they're like full of like anti-grazing deterrent chemicals. So yeah, we have seen the odd nibble here or there, but not like not like when I've done experiments out planting spice bush and oats and they're all gone.
Yeah, deer do impact those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Reese asks, is breeding for seed size smaller being done to increase the amount of pulp in a fruit?
Yes, so there are, as I mentioned, we're not doing any breeding work ourselves. We're hoping to do some kind of selections from trees that we've got at our site that we believe are producing good quality fruit, which down the line could lead to some new varietals. Not all, but a number of the varietals are actually technically selections rather than being bred per se. That's not true for all of them. There are a number of really nicely bred varietals, particularly things like Susquehanna and the other ones, and Turkey State has one called like KSU Atwood. So there's a variety of them that have been bred, and one of the things that they do breed for is reduced seediness, to try and increase that pulp yield. So yeah, that's a good reason for using varietals, because some of them have much better pulp to seed ratios. That's not the case for all of them though.
Okay. Bryce asks, when thinning the number of suckers, what's the target spacing? Do you have a spacing between what's left?
Well, I mean, at the moment, I would describe our kind of approach as like a bit of an adaptive management approach, because I don't think I can give you a number right now for like what the right spacing or density is. We kind of had a similar question previously. So at the moment, although I couldn't give you a kind of a density, we thinned them down in those plots where they were very thick to ensure that there was about 5 to 6 feet between them. Okay. And Brad can probably recall what our spacing is in the orchard. I believe is it 6 foot, Brad?
I don't know, but he did say that the Piketon site had an area that was not fenced and the deer took them out.
Yeah. Bad deer.
But he hasn't responded to that one. Let's see, Florian wants to, I want to use air prune beds to grow pawpaws. I can only get compost with high pH, 8-9. I want to mix it with quasar sand, 1 to 3 millimeter coarse ratio compost, sand 3-to-1. Will pawpaw grow in this compost? How can I lower pH safely and organic certified? That's a
good question. So your compost has a high pH. That's interesting. Here, Brad. So I'll come back to that. Brad says our orchard spacing is 15 feet between rows and 10 foot within rows. So yeah, it's a 10-foot spacing. So we're slightly denser than in the orchards.
Okay.
I mean, we can. Yeah. If you got alkaline compost, that's interesting. I guess the easiest way to lower pH would be to carefully add flowers of sulfur to it, or things like, I'm not sure if hollytone is organic or not, but there are organic amendments that people use for doing things like growing blueberries and hydrangeas. So you could probably use that to manipulate your pH. But otherwise, yeah, a mixture of compost and sand seems sensible. As I say, as long as you don't let them get moisture stressed, they'll be fine, and keep them air pruned. That's a good thing to do.
Okay. Sandy asked, thoughts and/or any study done on successive grafting suckers versus planting newly grafted seedlings?
Okay, so yes, so we are going to do that in our orchard. So as I mentioned, when we planted out that orchard, we planted out a mixture of ready grafted varietals of a couple of different stock types, as well as seedling trees. By which it's been grown on from seed, so they're non-grafted. The idea with those seedling trees is that we will eventually graft in additional varieties. So we'll be able, the trees weren't big enough when they were first planted to graft onto. They're getting there now, so we are aiming to do some grafting this year and next. So we'll be able to tell you about that in due course. The little, again, I showed you some pictures of the woodland grafts that we did. That was like really kind of pilot, small scale, just to see if they would actually take and survive. We were a little bit late in the year and the survival rate wasn't great. Some of that was to do with damage, but yeah, we need more data on that to be able to give you a strong number.
Mark asks, will pawpaws grow in association with a stand of conifers?
Gosh, good question. I've never seen that. It's going to depend a lot on, I mean, light is going to be the big thing. I don't know what you,
Right.
not sure what you mean by a stand of conifers. If you're talking like a pine plantation, then they're not going to be very happy. But, you know, if it's underneath yeah, it's going to depend a lot on soil conditions and soil pH and soil depth and where exactly you are. You know, if you've got pines, there's other things going on in the environment than just the fact that you've got pines there. I don't know. I mean, try planting some and let us know. I've never seen that combination, but it doesn't mean that you can't make it happen.
So we've had growers do Christmas trees and black walnut. So the Christmas trees train the walnut to grow nice and straight. I don't know how that works with pawpaw. And then you harvest the Christmas trees and you're left with a walnut plantation. Carl Young did that over around Springfield for years, and it was amazing to watch. But whether pawpaw would react similarly, I don't know. Bryce asks, is there a complementary ground cover to grow beneath pawpaw to help prevent erosion?
Gosh, yeah, good question. Pawpaw casts a lot. If you've got a pawpaw stand, they cast a lot of shade, so there tends not to be a lot of ground cover underneath them.
Yeah, you'd have to find something.
It's going to depend on the density. We get a lot of the sites where we got pawpaw flowers. We have quite nice early spring wildflowers on some of them in the woodlands. You know, the usual things like trilliums and wild ginger and you know, all kinds of different sedges there where the forest cover is not too dense. But once the pawpaw trees start getting big and dense and casting a lot of shade, then there's not much that's going to grow underneath it.
Petra asks, are there any publications discussing about pawpaws outcompeting honeysuckle? In other words, should pawpaw be planted after invasive honeysuckle removal? Fruit bearing would be nice, but not the main goal.
That is a good question.
I haven't seen anything on the invasive.
I don't recall. Certainly, that's one of the reasons that we like pawpaw is because we don't tend to see honeysuckle in association with it. But it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? Or there's a trade-off because, you know, pawpaw is great because it's native and it produces fruit. But the things that concern us about honeysuckle, for example, in forests, that it casts deep shade and prevents regeneration of native tree species, that would equally apply to a dense stand of pawpaw. And actually, I have seen one paper, I think it was from Tennessee, where they were looking at methods to control pawpaw because of it was casting so much, it was limiting, it was so abundant, it was almost behaving like an invasive species and preventing regeneration of timber stands. So they were putting prescribed fires through and looking at mortality of pawpaw during prescribed burning. So yeah, it's good to suppress it in some locations, but you know, I wouldn't necessarily advocate that we want homogeneous understories of pawpaw throughout all of our forests.
Well, and we also know that honeysuckle can leave behind some allelopathic soil chemicals. So how does that impact what you'd be trying to do with the pawpaw? Maybe at a young age that would impact them more so than.
If you've got, you know, isolated outbreaks of dense honeysuckle and you clear it out, obviously the big concern is always the potential for reinvasion and what's in the soil seed bank. And even if you've done chemical control to prevent it resprouting, you get a lot of germination. Right. So maybe in that situation, planting pawpaw to provide some competition in those locations would be a good idea. So I don't discount it. But it's not I don't think it's a magic bullet. It's like.
So Sandy says she's in Sacramento, California.
Oh, wow.
I found a couple grafted varieties got harvested either a month early or later than what the same varieties did in the Midwest. She's going to track it again this year, but could her growing zone really impact the fruit harvest by that much? And a follow-up, what data should I be tracking for that?
Gosh, yeah, so we do know, we have, as part of Sarah's work, you know, she was monitoring production in across Ohio from, you know, top to bottom. And there is definitively a you know, a phenological change from, you know, the timing of the phenology does definitely vary from south to north. Things down south are at least a couple of weeks earlier than they are up north. Without knowing the kind of precise climate of your area and how that compares to what I'm familiar with, I don't know whether what you see is reasonable, but yeah, definitely track it. That would be really interesting information to have. So if you're looking at doing monitoring, I would look at things like the date of the first bud break of the flowers. That's a kind of easy thing to monitor. And you could also keep an eye on, you know, when you first see fruit set. So when you first see a pollinated flower, and then the next stage would be, you know, at what point does the fruit reach ripeness and harvestability?
Okay, so Tom asks, on my 5 acres, I have an open canopy, 30-foot plus tall, 6-inch DBH tree that flowers profusely but rarely sets more than 2 to 4 hands of fruit every year. The few fruit are large and some of the best tasting in my woods. Nearby smaller trees, probably not clonal, are much more productive but not as tasty. I've tried roadkill to bring in some more pollinators with no success. Any tips given your research so far?
All right, what was it? Can you repeat what the kind of attributes of the woodland were?
So he has 5 acres,
Yeah.
open canopy, 30-foot tall, 6-inch plus DBH tree that flowers profusely but rarely sets more than 2 to 4 hands of fruit, whereas he's got smaller ones nearby that aren't as tasty.
Yeah.
And are much more productive.
Yeah, again, I'm hypothesizing here, right? But well, first thing to say is there is just a lot of variation in the quality and attributes of wild fruit. It's highly variable between trees. You can have trees that are producing little golf balls next to trees that are producing, you know, really nice fruit. You can have ones that taste like, as I said, like diesel next to something that's, you know, beautiful. So, you know, underlying genetic characteristics have a really strong influence both on like levels of productivity and on the characteristics of the fruit. When it comes to, like, you know, you've got trees, you know, some trees that are producing lots of small fruit versus few big fruits. I'm not a geneticist, but, you know, there's going to be some kind of genetic control there, I assume, on how the tree is, you know, proportioning out the energy that it has available for reproduction, right? You know, for the same amount of energy, you can produce lots of small fruit versus one big fruit. So I would guess that that's a genetic control. You've seen that in terms of enhancing productivity of that tree. Again, I would guess that it's probably actually, I don't know, it's actually probably setting a lot of fruit in many of those flowers are getting pollinated, but what you're not seeing is many of them come through to maturity. So anything that you can do to try and reduce competition around that tree and enhance light availability for it well, that's what we're working on the basis of. I can't tell you yet whether or not it actually is gonna make a difference. Certainly, we see this big difference between open grown versus, you know, closed canopy woodlands. So what happens in between and what that like gradient of change in productivity looks like as you increase light availability, we don't really know yet. You know, it might be like there's like a really sharp cutoff at some point. You know, it's like some kind of threshold that above which they really begin producing a lot of fruit. But we're trying to investigate that a bit more. And one of the things that we're actually going to do to try and, I know I'm like hedging so many of these questions that I feel bad, but you have to bear with us because it's early days. So one of the experiments that we're doing is actually going to our orchards or with some of the growers where they have established trees that we know are highly productive. And rather than kind of increasing light availability in the woodlands where we have non-productive fruits, non-productive trees, we're going to kind of flip that question and actually create shade enclosures around productive trees grown outside where we've got varietals, so we know they're genetically identical, and we can reduce light availability and look at how that affects yield. And then we should have a better sense of this relationship between yield and light availability and be able to answer these questions properly.
We've had several questions about the high and low input discussion you had. Could you kind of clarify some of that? Some folks were a little foggy on so they can understand the concept that you were talking about.
Okay, so this is in our orchard, and actually, if folk have the chat available, I think Brad has posited a response in there a little bit. But okay, so the idea with high and low input, right, is that we want to evaluate how, horticultural practice, essentially, investment in growing these trees, whether it enhances their growth and production. So one of the things that people have often said, at least during the establishment phase of pawpaws, is that they suffer quite a lot from drought stress and root damage. And sometimes people have reported relatively low survival rates for outplanted trees. So we worked on when we designed these kind of orchards, and initially our focus was just on orchard establishment. So like, how could we get the trees to survive and grow on? We worked on the basis that there were kind of two key things that could be important. The biggest one of them being moisture availability, and then there was this question of sun scorch as well. Particularly, we were particularly concerned about that for the seedling trees, because those were seedlings grown on from wild collected seed from woodlands, right? Some of the varietals that have actually been germinated and grown from seedling stage outside seem to be a bit less susceptible to sun scorch. Okay, so that was the kind of basis on which we were working. So the orchard setup consists of two different treatments. We have what we call our low input side, where essentially all we did is plant the trees just straight into the ground, dig a planting hole, plop them in, and then walk away. We do some weed control around them, just using a broad spectrum herbicide to stop the weeds getting up and overtopping them, because they're pretty small, these trees, to begin with. So we do that, but that's the only thing that happens in the low input side. It's just weed control, chemical weed control around the trees. On the high input side, we took some lessons that Brad had learned from some of his other production systems, and we actually mounded up the soil using a plow. So we created mounds, and then we planted into those mounds through landscape fabric. Okay, so the idea there is like we're creating improved soil conditions, we're reducing the potential for evaporation from the soil, we're suppressing weeds, through the plastic mulch. And then we also have like a drip irrigation system throughout the whole that high inputs, which we turn on. Well, it's running almost continuously during the summer. So again, to try and evaluate this effect of reducing moisture stress. So it's an economic trade-off that we're trying to understand, right? Is that we expected to see high mortality in the low input side and to have to replace some of those trees, maybe over an ongoing period, versus what's the cost of that, and what's the kind of the growth rate associated with that system versus this relatively high upfront cost of prepping the site through the use of the plastic mulch and the irrigation, the ongoing cost of irrigation. How does that trade-off work in terms of increased survival, increased growth rate, time to maturity, time to reproductive maturity is a big thing as well. It takes quite a number of years for these orchards to come into production. So will we reduce that through this high input system? So that's what we were doing and why.
Phil asks, what insect or disease problems have you detected? I know you talked a little bit.
The really big one's Phyllosticta. That's a problem because it's a fungal disease. It infects the leaves. It can cause pretty substantive defoliation when it gets bad, but it can also affect the fruit. And when the fruit are impacted by Phyllosticta, the skin blackens, and the cells in the skin actually die, so it doesn't expand as the fruit grows, and then you'll get cracking and damaging of the skin, which leads to non-marketable fruits. So Phyllosticta is a pretty substantial problem, particularly in orchards, as I mentioned. And so we are doing some work on that to look at cultural practices to try to reduce the abundance of Phyllosticta. The kind of big emerging one that some folk are concerned about is black spot, which is, I'm not sure that there's Brad maybe knows better than I. There's some debate about what the causal mechanism for it is, but there's another leaf disease which leads to kind of die back in the leaves. These black spots kind of fall and then drop out, and you're left with holes in the leaf. Mm-hmm. And then the kind of big pest disease is the Pawpaw peduncle borer.
Peduncle borer.
Pawpaw peduncle borer, which is lays a little larvae, which was believed to only kind of munch into the peduncle of the flower, right, and damage the flower. But actually, it's been found in multiple parts of the plant, including in the fruit. So that is a potential issue. Yeah.
Wow.
I'm not aware of it being an explosive problem yet, but as we scale up production, it's something to be aware of.
So Anthony wants to know, any thoughts on sort of the bioethics of intervention in wild stands, particularly if you're removing other natives?
Yes, that's a good question. Yes, I do think about that a lot. I mean, yeah. Where to start with that? So I think I could do a whole lecture on this, and do several lectures on this kind of stuff in my restoration course. I think I would probably start from the basis of challenging the assumption that our forests are natural to begin with, right? So if we okay, there are natural processes that go on in our woodlands, but most of them are secondary forests, right, that have grown up post-European colonization. And even prior to that, there's good evidence that many of our woodlands were manipulated by native people, for example, the use of fire, right? So the ecological structure, composition of our forest, reflection both of nature, natural processes, but also of cultural processes. You could, I guess, go back to the ideas of Aldo Leopold. I'm going to totally mangle his quote now, right? The kind of godfather of environmental ethics. And I think he said something along the lines of, a thing is right when it tends to enhance the stability, diversity, and beauty of a system. It's wrong when it tends to do otherwise. So I think the question that we could ask ourselves is, do these interventions fundamentally alter the functioning of our system, the productivity of it, and the diversity of it? I would argue not. I mean, obviously, I would argue that the choices that we're making are not doing that, at least in no more than, for example, maple syrup tapping might, or other forms of non-timber forest production might. Does that mean that it would be impossible to intervene in stands in ways that are ecologically unjustifiable? Very definitely, right? I don't want to be going around being the person that promotes chopping down all of your forest canopy to promote the growth of pawpaws, right? That's not my objective here. So the lesson will, yeah, it's an age-old challenge, right? But yes, we're clearing, we're removing competition from spice bush, for example, but we're not killing it. It will resprout. It will regrow. You could think of it as analogous to a coppice production system, right? Mm-hmm. And that material that we're removing is being used as another marketable product. There's always trade-offs in any intervention that we make in restoration. What I'm hoping that we'll find through monitoring our interventions in these plots is that the trade-offs will not outweigh the benefits, right? And so, you know, we're not just going to be tracking pawpaw productions in these plots we've intervened in. We'll be trying to look at the response of the ground flora, evidence of reinvasion, changes in diversity, tree recruitment within those plots. So I hope there's actually multiple benefits for woodland management that can come out of managing pawpaw stems. Doesn't mean that you manage every forest everywhere and every inch of your forest for pawpaw production, right?
Anthony says, great answer to the question.
Thank you.
Heidi asks, what about fertilizing the wild forest stand? Would that make any difference?
So we have looked at, try to go back a minute. When we looked at did all that kind of analysis of forest, the probability of producing fruit, and we've actually done some analysis of like the numbers of fruit that trees produce as well. We did account for, we did include analysis of soil conditions within that. We did not find any particularly significant effect of soils, soil type, soil nutrient status, soil pH. We had a relatively variable range of conditions, maybe more so in terms of texture than in nutrient content, but quite a big range in organic matter availability. We didn't find any particular effect of that. We have discussed in the orchard the potential for in the future, once the trees are a bit more established, the system set up so we can do fertigation of the high input stands, so to fertilize them and look at whether that improves growth and production. So we'll get some information on that. I'm a little bit nervous about the idea of chucking fertilizer around within forest, but you know, if you have stands that are on thin soils, introducing organic materials and compost might be viable, but yeah, we haven't, you know, I wouldn't advise that. We've got no evidence at present to suggest that it would be advantageous in woodland stands.
So I've got several questions that talk about the relationship between black walnuts and pawpaws. Are pawpaws resistant to jugular? Do they grow together?
You probably have a better sense of that than I do, Kathy. You're a real...
Well, I mean, I have seen them in close proximity, but if you think about where you usually find pawpaw in the woods, that's not always a great walnut site, but it can be. I mean, that's kind of that bottomland, but if it's well drained.
Yeah, will do okay there, right?
Yeah, so I don't know that there's any reason why they wouldn't grow together. The interesting thing with juglans is that it doesn't always impact other hardwood trees. It's trying to plant tomatoes and other things underneath a walnut tree that it impacts. If you think about a forest, you have walnut in mixed stands, so it's not necessarily having the kind of impact we think about, I think.
That's an interesting question. You know what? I've got a few leftover pawpaw seedlings I need to plant this spring, and we've got a couple of sites, both in Columbus and on some other OSU properties where it's pretty much all walnut.
Mm-hmm.
Go and plant those pawpaw seedlings underneath the black walnut and tell you whether
what happens.
So check back in. It won't be very scientific, but we'll do it and see what happens. Someone in the chat has just said, I have production of fruit near walnut trees. So that's,
Yeah.
that's you know,
I don't see that it's a detriment.
Walnut might be a good tree for them, right? Because they don't have a particularly dense canopy. They have that nice kind of diffuse leaf canopy structure, a lot of light through it. So, you know, it might be an interesting kind of, you know, multi-structure system.
They're one of the last to leaf out in the spring, and they're one of the first to lose their leaves in the fall. So there's a more open canopy. I don't know how, I'd have to think about, you know, that timing, but walnut's definitely one of the last to leaf out in spring, and I would bet that pawpaw is probably ahead of that.
I'm gonna do it. We're
gonna. Mark wants to know, should we be concerned that as we bring in genetic material from other areas through grafting, that we're eliminating the native genetic material from that area?
Yeah, consideration. I don't think we're going to eliminate the genetic material, but we potentially could alter it if, and that's the big if the fruit that are produced go on to reproduce, right? If they're so, you know, so bringing that material, yes, we're going to introduce new genetic material. The question is, right, the fruit is the new genetic material, but that tree fertilizes other trees, the wild trees in the plot which produce fruit, right? If those fruit fall and the seeds germinate, they would be obviously a cross between the wild plant and the introduced plants. That is a consideration. So, you know, might be, you know, if you're worried about kind of genetic diversity, and you know, I couldn't give you an answer as to whether that enhancement of genetic diversity would like alter the resilience of pawpaws, or you know, the character of the forest in the longer term. But you know, so long as you're intervening in stands that are where you're, you know, pretty sure you're going to harvest the fruit, then it's maybe less of a concern. And if you're not going to harvest the fruit anymore, then maybe you should chop down the grafted tree before you leave the property. But, I mean, clonal spread's not going to be a concern, because remember, you're grafting onto a wild rootstock, so it's only the above ground part of the introduced tree that's going to be new genetic material. There might be ways to mitigate the issue, because there's also the possibility that pollen is being spread to trees many miles away, and you have control over that. So yeah, it's something I've worried about. Again, it's one of those trade-off situations, right? But we, you know, when we do restoration work with forests and we introduce, you know, we replant, we're you know, often introducing genetically, you know, non-local material. We use it where we can, but not always.
Macy asked, do you use
I was going to say, if you're concerned about that, you know, one other option would be, we had that example of like the really good, high quality, productive tree that somebody had on their property, right? If you've got a situation like that where you've got a great selection of your own and you want to use locally sourced material, then, you know, monitor your own trees, identify the ones that are good, track them for a couple of years, and then you can cut your own scionwood and do your own grafting into different parts of the landscape using local material. So you can create your own selections. Many of these commercial varieties just started out as wild selections.
Okay, so Macy asked, do you use Q-tips for hand pollination?
No, we used little tiny paintbrushes, but yeah, I'm sure you could use a Q-tip.
Wow. Let's see. As part of a CSP wildlife enhancement program, I'll be planting 25 bare root pawpaw this spring. I'll be planting 18 of these seedlings in a partially shaded understory and the remainder in an open field. I was planning to use tree tubes and weed mats on all trees. Will tree tubes be a problem?
Weed mats is probably a good idea. Depends on the type of tree tube, I might say. There's kind of mixed messaging on tree tubes, right, Kathy? I mean,
well, we used them on some of the trees.
I think it's going to be an issue, then you want to protect them in some way. But the technique that we've used to, because you know, it was more about shading. We used you know, a metal T-post with some wire fencing wrapped around it, and then shade cloth wrapped around that. And that'd be better, because then you've got airflow through the guards. And you know, I don't know what kind of trees they are, whether they're just seedlings or whether they're varietals. But you know, if you've invested a lot of money in them, then protect them.
So we put tree tubes.
If they're really tight, you can get kind of disease in there. And pawpaw produce, like, you know, a lot of really big leaves. I can imagine it might get a bit restricted and soggy, moist and sweaty in there. I don't know. We
used them on the trees we planted in the pawpaw patch at the Gwen. And those trees came up and out of that tree shelter within 2 years. Yep. So it was a matter of, you know, you had kind of a wispy seedling that you wanted to leave the tube on, or at least some kind of support, so that as it continued to grow. But I think all of those, we had trees up out of the tubes in 2 years.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we did a little tree tube experiment with some students in our restoration class, and I would say that the results were mixed. We definitely had higher survival where we used tree tubes. But as you say, they were pretty sad and etiolated and all fell over when the tree tubes came off. And there were definitely a few that where we were seeing signs of kind of disease, scorch within the tree tubes. So it's, personally, I would go like wire cage or like a mesh. You can get mesh tree tubes, right?
And you can get tree tubes that are ventilated now as well. So,
there's mesh.
But my recommendation on tree tubes always is, even after the tree comes up out of the tube, you need to leave that tube on for several years so that the seedling can put girth on that makes it able to stand on its own. Because if you take it off right away, you're going to have to stake it or something, because it can't do that. Let's see. How many years to first fruit?
Gosh, depends on the tree. For a seedling tree, at least 8 years. Well, 5 to 8 years. Let's say 5 to 8 years. For a grafted tree, well, actually, interestingly, the grafts will probably start flowering might even start flowering in the first year. If they do that, I would recommend taking the flowers off them to prevent them from trying to reproduce, because you want them to put their energy into growth and root development. So strip the flowers off. But yeah, 3 to 5 years to first fruit. As I said, I've got some in my front yard here. I planted them about 3 years ago, and they're kind of flowering. One flowered last year, and then they're all going to flower this spring, and they're big enough to produce something now. The ones in our orchards, they've been in a few years now, and some of them were flowering in the first year, and we had to take the flowers off.
Michael asked, any idea what the optimal soil chemistry is, pH, etc.?
I mean, they're pretty broad, maybe heading slightly towards the acid rather than the alkaline, but I don't know. Yeah, pretty. Everything that we monitored was kind of like circum-neutral, really. There was no, I don't know. It's a good question. You know, I know about distribution a bit more than I do.
Well, again, you're going to be, depending on where you are in Ohio, your pH. We have some growing on the Mansfield campus, and what the pHs were you found there were like 5s and 6s.
It's pretty massive, yeah.
So
I think they do better with acid rather than alkaline.
Okay. Let's see. Good nurseries to buy container starter trees.
Oh, am I allowed to? I don't know. Am I allowed to answer that? Am I allowed to pick up?
There are some native nurseries, like Riverside Native Nursery. He's been growing Pawpaw. You just have to kind of search, because
Riverside's great for wild trees. We actually, when we were buying large quantities, we got of seedling trees. We got them from the Indiana State Department of Forestry that have like a bare root tree production system, and they were very reasonably priced. Now, if you want grafted trees of commercial varietals, there are a number of different providers. The ones that we have used primarily are One Green World and England's Nursery in Kentucky, both of whom are great to work with. And they've got, England have a really nice range of varieties. And One Green World have got some good stuff too. They will also, England's will also supply scion wood if you're wanting to do your own graft.
Okay. How deep should seeds be planted, and what should the spacing be when trying to establish a wild site?
I'm sorry, what was the first part? Spacing in the wild, and
how deep should seeds be planted?
How deep should seeds be planted?
What's that spacing if you're trying to do a wild site, not an orchard?
So, gosh, I haven't done any direct seeding in the field, if that's the question. If you're talking about kind of seed depth, when we planted them in pots, we normally put them about 2 inches down.
Okay.
Space, yeah. I mean, space. if we're talking direct seeding, space them dense, man. I tell you what, no, we did do a little bit of direct seeding. We had some undergraduate students do it. Yes, at the wetlands. Sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah, we've set up some plots in which we did direct seeding of pawpaw. I think we planted about, depending on the plot, it's about between 150 to 170 seeds per plot. And our plots were, what were they? They were 6 feet in diameter, and we put about up to about 170 seeds in each of those. About an inch to 2 inches deep. We got, I think, it was pretty variable from plot to plot, but out of those we got about kind of 10 to 15 seedlings emerging. So direct seeding is pretty hit and miss. So plant them dense and thin them out. I mean,
so there is an online resource that you could go to, the Woody Plant Seed Manual, which is a U.S. Forest Service publication. They have all of the steps you need to take on how to handle the seed, whether it needs cold storage, does it need to be stratified, and you can get it for Pawpaw, because I know I've copied those pages for landowners before.
Yeah, so pawpaw, that's a good point, Kathy. So pawpaw seed, it needs to be kept damp. You can't let it dry out, or it will lose its viability, and it needs to be cold stratified. So if you're collecting the fruit in the fall and you're not immediately direct seeding, if you're just going to take the fruit, eat them, spit the pips out, and go plant them in your woods, don't worry. But if you're going to take them home and keep them in your refrigerator, or keep them at home to plant them out in the spring, then you need to cold stratify them. They need to be kept cold and moist. We have kept them in either in damp compost or in damp vermiculite.
Okay.
When we've done that and they've been adequately cold stratified, like 60 days or more, when we've done it, planting them in pots, we've had very good emergence rates, like upwards of 80% emergence. Less when you do direct seeding.
We are coming to the end of our time. I have to say we've answered 42 questions and there's still 34 sitting in the Q&A box.
Answered is a generous interpretation of some of my response.
But someone asked you to put back up, and I gotta find the shoot.
Looking the chart showing production of different varieties.
Oh yeah.
Cultivars. Yeah.
I think the chart I showed was potential economic return. So take that with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because it was very back of the envelope, as I said. We do report on the kind of average numbers of fruit per tree there. Don't just go on the basis of that, because we talked about this kind of size number thing, right? And like how you invest your energy. So just because the tree is producing a small number of fruit doesn't mean it's terrible. It oftentimes means it's producing like really big fruit.
Okay.
So if you want advice on varieties, flavor, particularly if you're growing for yourself, then you want to be considering flavor and quality as well as just quantity.
Okay. Well, Matt, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
This was awesome. And I'm gonna have Marnie stop recording so I can put the URL up for the continuing ed credits.